Look, I've got an excellent panel here, and I know some people are at the back. So there are two things tonight. If you want to have dinner, which is after that, please participate, otherwise I'll make it long last. The other one is very important, is that, maybe the Black Caps might win tonight, so we need to watch that too. So how it'll happen is I've got three panelists here and one in Mumbai, which is Ralph. They've got 3 minutes to give a little brief about what they think about globalization post-COVID. I've got a timer here. And then after that, we'll have some Q&A session and then wrap it up by 9:55 something. Oh, sorry, not 9:55, 7:55. So I'll start with Deidre.
Kia ora tātou katoa e mihi ana, kia tātou katoa I runga I te kaupapa o tēnei pō. Tuatahi māku e mihi ana ki te karakia o tēnei ata, ai muri I tēnā e mihi ana ki ngā tangata whenua o te Waitākere e mihi ana. Kia tātou katoa e raurangatira mai, hui mai nei e mihi ana kia tātou katoa. He mihi aroha, he mihi hariko tōku ngākau ki te kōrero atu kia tātou katoa. Kia ora, he uri ahau no Ngāpuhi te raroa, engari e mahi ana au ki NZTE, New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, I enei wā, e mihi ana kia tātou katoa. So kia ora, my name is Deidre Otene. It's an honour and privilege to be here with you all this evening. I'm sure you're all tired and wanting to head to dinner, so I won't bore you with any repetition, but just give you an overview of what I bring to the table. So prior to my role with New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, I worked in the community, or at a whānau or hapu level, we would call it as Māori, in building small business, economic development for whānau, and the development of overcoming inequity in terms of wellbeing. So after 15 years of working in Auckland and in Taitokera in Northland, I've taken on a role with New Zealand Trade and Enterprise to build Māori exports. So that's what I'm here to talk to you about tonight. Predominantly, my focus is on building relationships, because as Māori, that's the key to any trade agreement is based on a reciprocal relationship. So for us, it's around people or tangata, place or whenua, and the planet, so the environment, the taiao, and a reciprocal return on profit to create intergenerational change. Like you and our whānau in India, a focus on mokopuna, or those children to come ahead of us, is what all of our strategies are built on. So I think we have many alignments in terms of our values as Māori and how we can build relationships and trade moving into the future. We're also built on, and I heard this earlier, a culture that is ancient, or a whakapapa or genealogy that leads far beyond people. So those commonalities always connect cultures. And for Māori business, our values are underpinned on that. On a personal level, I had the opportunity of developing the first New Zealand women's kabaddi team to take to the World Cup in Ludhiana. And I think during that period of development and the time we spent in India, there were many alignments in terms of development of whānau economy or family economy, so the way that you all work together to ensure that everyone succeeds, and a work ethic that I think many of our generation now have never ever experienced in their life. So those are the experiences and knowledge that I bring to the table, and I hope my colleague Ralph can add some of the context in terms of what's happening over in India for us at the moment. Ngā mihi nui.
Thank you very much, Deidre. Kevin.
Kia ora, India, and respect, Deidre. Kavadi, awesome. Yeah, so 12 months ago I wrote a column in the Herald which talked about supply chain problems, and I used some data, but more importantly I drew on some stories from friends and family, including my nephew who's sitting over there, who works for a tech firm on the North Shore. Those stories were pretty horrendous. Things like things going missing, cargo going to the Philippines and then being flown back to Germany and so on. So we're still hearing lots of those stories, and some of the patterns of the future, I think, are starting to emerge, and they're quite fundamental and very important for New Zealand and, of course, India. But actually, what I'd like to do is to tell a positive story tonight. So about a year ago, my firm MartinJenkins did a study of the manufacturing industry in New Zealand. We did that for the Manufacturing Alliance, which is a group of peak bodies, plastics, steel and metals and so forth. If you go back to the last shock, the GFC kind of crushed manufacturing in New Zealand. It really got smacked around. But if you fast forward to today, manufacturing is pretty much back to where it was pre-GFC. We're all aware of the narrative around the fact that manufacturing in New Zealand is in long-term decline. And that's fascinating because in one sense that's true, in another it's not. What I mean by that is that in absolute terms it's growing, but in percentage terms it's declining only because other sectors like services are growing. So if you reflect on that, manufacturing in New Zealand, it's got its ups and downs, but in aggregate it's healthy. It still remains 10% of GDP in the ballpark, about 10% of jobs in New Zealand, and upwards of 50% of our exports. And those exports, of course, include a lot of processed foods and so forth, but also high-tech companies like PowerShield that my nephew works for. So, there are also some data issues which might make that story even better. So I don't want to get into the detail. But basically, you imagine a company that, say, spends 60% of its effort on things like maintenance and training, and the other 40% actually making things. Chances are that's going to be coded as services, not manufacturing. So there's a bit of a case to suggest that manufacturing in New Zealand is even better than the data shows. So that's largely all I wanted to say. It's the flip side of what Deepak said earlier. He talked about FDI into India. I'm speaking to the people in India who are on this in this conference and others, and I'm saying to you, it is worth taking a close look at investing in New Zealand and manufacturing. It's a dynamic sector. And speaking of sport, we all talk about cricket. I'm as fascinated as every other single person, but let's not forget things like hockey, kabaddi, and lots of other sports. And last time I spoke at this conference summit, I talked about how fast rugby is growing in India. True story. So keep an eye out for rugby tests within 10 years between India and the All Blacks. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Professor Guy.
Kia ora koutou, namaste. Ko Guy Littlefair tūku ingoa. It's a pleasure to be here this evening and see you all. Perhaps I should just confess that I hold a British passport, a New Zealand passport and an Australian passport, so I never ever talk about sport because it's far too dangerous. I had the privilege of visiting India over 30 years ago, and since then I've travelled to India so many times, and whenever I travel to Hyderabad, I always visit Paradise Restaurant, and I'm very much looking forward to our dinner tonight to see whether it matches up to Paradise. So I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor International at AUT here in Auckland, and I'm broadly responsible for international marketing, international recruitment, international relations, and the provision of English language to overseas students. We've heard a lot this evening about statistics, and just to prove that an academic in New Zealand is also quite good at some statistics, I thought I'd give you some details actually on the value of international education to New Zealand. And some of these statistics may well come as a surprise to you. These figures relate to 2019. Of course, 2020 and 2021 are quite different. But you may well be surprised to know that in 2019, New Zealand's fifth largest export was international education. The value of international students coming to New Zealand was over $5 billion. And only 1.2 billion of those $5 billion was actually revenue direct to universities. So nearly 4 times the amount of money that comes into university goes into the economy through other ways. It goes in through tourism, our students going to local businesses, to cafes, to restaurants, and in many, many other ways. And another way of expressing it is that actually international students coming to New Zealand support over 48,000 jobs. It is a huge part of our economy. Of those students, in 2019, over 17,000 of them were from India, and over 3,000 of them were in our university sector. And AUT, the university that I represent, has had a long history with Indian students, and typically we have around 1/3 of all of the Indian students here. But I must say, international education is not just about what the universities do. International education is about broadening the diversity in our communities, in our towns and our cities. And it's that diversification which really creates understanding, respect, and tolerance. 3 very important things for the world that we currently live in. And also, the value of international education is about the soft diplomacy that we see. Our international students, many of them stay in New Zealand, many of them return to their home countries, and also many of them travel to other countries, but they will always be, in the future, ambassadors for New Zealand, and the amount of soft diplomacy that is carried on as a result is quite significant. I would also just like to say that the value of education actually to the individual is very significant. It can lift people out of poverty. It supports not only that individual, but it supports their families and their communities. And beyond that, it really supports the future of this world. And I cannot value enough and express to you enough tonight the importance, beyond the value and beyond the revenue, of education, and particularly international education. Kia ora.
Thank you very much, Professor Deidre. And over to Ralph, who's the Honorary Consul, who's the Consul-General and Trade Commissioner in Mumbai. Good morning, Ralph, or good afternoon, and welcome. You've got 3 minutes.
Thanks very much. I'll try and squeeze it in as best I can. First of all, a big thank you to the INZBC team for putting this event together. An interesting time as we hopefully begin the return to the new normal and a chance to leverage the benefits of globalisation again. What happens next? We have serious choices to make and many options to consider as either scary threats or wonderful opportunities. Anyway, working for NZTE as New Zealand's Trade Commissioner for South Asia based in Mumbai, I'll be looking at globalisation through my lens as we explore this topic today. So just quickly, I'll start with a bit of background on the global and New Zealand trade dynamic. From a global perspective, have the following points. So WTO has reported a rise in trade measures linked to COVID-19. COVID-19 is still disrupting, we've heard it before, supply chains globally in many places. And it's been a bit of a feature over the last year, especially for my team here working in India. Countries are looking at becoming more self-reliant as a result, especially with regard to food security. A slowdown in globalisation, a move to regionalisation is making headlines, as well as a rise in trends like shop local as concerns about climate change rise. From a New Zealand perspective, we've got the following. New Zealand's trade to GDP ratio peaked in the year 2000 at 35.7% before levelling out around 25%. And New Zealand's service exports have grown over the past 30 years to around 30% of GDP, and this is currently dominated by tourism. We're starting to see signs of trade recovery from COVID, and with the vaccine rollout expected to be widely available from the second half of 21, it would be reasonable to expect that most of the population will immunise by the first quarter of 22. In December 2020, goods exports rose by 24 million to 60 billion. Goods imports fell 7.4 billion, 11% to around 57 million. I believe that New Zealand has benefited somewhat from its exports not being made up of a high number of imported components, and a majority of everything we export from New Zealand is actually produced here. Our exports come from our land and sea, which gives New Zealand a slight export income advantage during COVID-19 because supply chain disruptions have made it somewhat less to us than other countries. The New Zealand government's trade response to the impact of COVID being to announce in their 2020 budget to invest an additional 216 million over 4 years into New Zealand trade and enterprise. An increase of NZTE's budget will help put more boots on the ground globally, increase investment into trade digitisation via capability building for New Zealand exporters. Despite our COVID-19 free advantage and strong New Zealand economic rebound, challenges and supply chain issues and constraints and market access continue to make life tricky for New Zealand exporters. Some key points with regard to New Zealand-India trade relationship. India is New Zealand's 11th largest two-way trading partner in goods and services, and its trade's valued around 2.7 billion in the year to March 2020. NZTE India works with approximately 100 companies and around 25 of them intensely. New Zealand trade with India has traditionally been in primary products, but is shifting towards more value-added products. Key sectors of engagement for New Zealand companies include specialised manufacturing, food and beverage, IT and aviation. NZTE works with a smaller number of agri-tech companies and occasional engagement around wood and timber. Some New Zealand companies have set up sales offices, manufacturing or assembly operations in India and are delivering products and solutions to their customers. For me, it's about tapping into the resource of India to build scalability. Examples include Fresco, dry powder handling, Simpro Holdings, agricultural implements, Glide Path with baggage handling equipment, and Raycon, who have around 600 plus staff in Bangalore producing crystal oscillators for the space, defence and communications industry. One of the key areas for focus for NZTE and India going forward will be around e-commerce. The India online grocery sector expected to reach 20 to 25 billion by 2025. India and Asian middle classes are predicted to be the main drivers of global consumption between now and the year 2050. We have New Zealand companies already selling into Big Basket and Food Hall, and so watch this space. And finally, in my opinion, the key advantages India has from a perspective of globalisation is its demographic structure, young consumer population, its strategic position, access to shipping lanes, etc., and good access to energy. The question is, how will New Zealand and India take advantage of this? Thank you, and back to you. Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks very much, Ralph, and thanks to all the panelists for their starting comments. I've just got a few questions that have come through and also that have been throughout the day. And I'll actually start off with Ralph, since he was the last one. Look, Ralph, India is a market of touch, feel, smell, etc. But with COVID, how do you think New Zealand exporters should be taking a step forward or innovate?
That's a good question. Look, over the last year, it has been a challenge because the Indian dynamic is you want to get to know people, build trust. They want to see you face to face. So a lot of this year, or a lot of the last year, we've actually had to rely on existing relationships, which are firmly in place and strong traditional. But obviously, with technology starting to become the norm, we're getting used to it. Zoom calls and things like that are become a sort of a feature of our day. We are using our local staff on the ground to try and connect face to face or do due diligence with potential partners. There's still a lot to improve, but I think we've adapted quite well, and Zoom people are becoming more comfortable in that area. But building that trust over time, still working on it. It's not perfect, but lots to do.
Thanks very much, Ralph. I've got a question probably for Deidre and Deepak, so I'll start off with you, Deidre. Recently, we've heard a lot about nationalism and indigenous business, etc. Over the years, the Maori economy has come up, and people talk about it. But do you think there is a rise and there is a space for indigenous market and products, etc., globally?
Yeah, can you hear me? Sorry, is that on? Definitely. The Māori economy at the moment is valued around $60 billion, and we, at a iwi, hapu and whānau level, are already engaged in trade. So it's not a new thing for us. It's been a historical practice from our tupuna that we have been involved with. The ability to develop on that, again, is based on relationships. So how do our cultural relationships align? And also, how can we be involved in those bigger trade talks? So around free trade agreements and where do Māori fit in that space? Also around the ability to open up our primary industry into India. So that's our key driver in terms of the Māori economy.
So where does the Maori fit in the FTA globally? In
terms of our perspective on it?
Yes.
We definitely, in terms of Māori business, that's where we want to see New Zealand go towards. So being able to trade freely, but also the decrease in tariffs to allow us to increase profits is definitely a space we want to be in.
Thank you. Deepak, I'll come to you. Where do you see the indigenous Indian economy going globally? Or is there a space for it?
So, Carmen, there's a lot happening on it. I had alluded, see, the first trend which I'm noticing, actually, it was underlying earlier, it's just that it got catalyzed by this little virus, has been onshoring of supply chains. Just let me put it, and Kevin alluded to that, in his remarks too, if I recollect. I'll tell you, on the 1st of March last year, before the pandemic, so my own personal book at Invest India was $83 billion of 518 odd companies which were looking to move those supply chains. Even during this pandemic and this close down, that book today is at excess of $160 billion. These are all shifting of supply chains from across the globe coming in. And I see this trend gathering more and more momentum. The fact is, going forward, it is going to be efficiency, and it is going to be closer to where the market is. That is where balance sheets will grow. It could be of any company in the world, anywhere. So they will go closer to where the market opportunity is. That's the only way to grow that balance sheet and that bottom line. Now, as far as the local indigenous business is concerned, let me tell you, one of the biggest strengths of India, if I asked you that question, you'll raise your hand and say IT. Actually, let me tell you, before IT, the biggest strength of India was my MSMEs. I've got close to, 6 billion or 60 million MSMEs in India. And the interesting point there, and I told you their strengths, frugal innovation and the ability to innovate and pivot their business models. Now, what has happened with this COVID thing is the point of digitization. And what this digitization is doing is empowering every individual and every business, regardless of their geographic location. It is getting them access to the market, it is getting them access to education or opportunities or whatever. So the strength, what you will see, is going to be from my indigenous MSMEs, which are now going to propel the growth. And in fact, a large number of supply chains, when they are moving into India, are looking to touch base and connect with my MSMEs to get that production part going. You would have heard about Make in India. This Make in India or indigenizing supply chains is not just a thought for India. It was about taken into account and created by extensive global stakeholder inputs, where they felt that these were the strengths of India, where they needed to be working hard. And this is how global companies, by attaching themselves to these Indian strengths, could make themselves globally competitive. And that is what we are seeing. Sorry, Carmen, I'm going a little longer than you had expected me to. But I thought I must bring the point across to you as to why these changes are happening. And I saw you looking at your next question. So I'll take it back to you.
No, thank you. By the way, this is Sunil. I don't sound like Carmen. But look, I just
my
want to
apologies.
bring in, no, that's all right. I just want to bring in Kevin on to piggyback off one of the things that you've said about manufacturing, right? Kevin, do you think people will see taking manufacturing offshore to countries like India or maybe even Sri Lanka, for that matter, or other places? And will it impact New Zealand businesses? Do you think New Zealand businesses should go out?
Good question. So I think it's a complex picture, actually. So you've got the question of taking manufacturing closer to market, the people who are buying the stuff. That's one thing, and that is happening. Equally, it's kind of hard to do sometimes during COVID. You're also seeing the exact opposite. So, for example, Japan has been repatriating some manufacturing to Japan, and that's been happening in other countries in Asia as well. So that's fascinating. I'd also like to touch on another angle about some of what drives that, and that's the labour market side. So we hear a lot of talk about China, and in fact that that argument that they've kind of used up their workforce and that they're running out of people to keep expanding on that front, and perhaps some of that manufacturing has been shipped out of China. I think we're at I'm pretty confident we are at an inflection point across the world where the rural population is now starting to crest and will start to decline. We hear a lot about China, Japan, Germany, and so on. Actually, Bangladesh is no longer replacing itself. And there are very few countries in the world actually who are replacing themselves. And even they will crest in the next sort of 50 years. And so to the extent that manufacturing sometimes follows people, that's another dynamic. So I guess it's complex. But I think New Zealand is really well placed in terms of more high value manufacturing, and I encourage our friends in India to have a look.
Thanks very much. Just before I go to Akshay, Professor, obviously COVID's had a big impact on the education sector. The education sector, I suppose, globally has innovated, etc. Do you think, with New Zealand borders being closed, do you think the universities, etc., are innovating, and is there room for innovation, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly the universities have had to innovate. Clearly during the first lockdown last year, there was a significant amount of innovation moving all of our courses suddenly to have to deliver online. There is talk about online education being the future of international education. My personal view is that online education is never going to replace all of the benefits of a university education. I think where universities need to focus in the future, however, is much more around developing strategic alliances with universities overseas. We have in New Zealand seen some steps forward with respect to India. So the end of 2019, all of the universities signed an agreement with IIT in Delhi to work together for the benefit of our students and research initiatives. And AUT signed an agreement with IIT Madras last year around our research in materials engineering. And we're also working on a relationship with IIT Hyderabad, interestingly enough, in the advanced manufacturing sphere. It is interesting, you know, obviously I don't come from New Zealand. I live here now. I've lived in New Zealand twice. I think in so many ways what I see about New Zealand is we punch above our weight. But where I don't think we punch above our weight really is around strategic alliances with respect to education and with respect to other partnerships. When I was in Australia as an academic, I spent a lot of time working with companies in India. We did research work for Barrett Forge, for TCS, for Scient, who used to be named Infotech. And what I'm trying to champion here in New Zealand is actually opportunities beyond that mass student recruitment, and actually how we can leverage our research expertise for the benefit of our own country, but also for the benefit of countries particularly like India.
Thanks very much. I think New Zealand needs to do something in research and development. We are very low in that. Akshay, I'll come to you. Where do you see what are the driving force or the driving sectors post-COVID in geoeconomics, especially in relations to Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, I think perhaps two things are becoming clear. One is that any kind of incentives and stimulus is not working as they used to once work. This is tough news for anybody, actually, particularly people like Mr. Bagla who are in this role, because incentives have become very difficult. Tax incentives no longer working. When the American government actually introduced tax incentives, most of the companies used it to buy back shares. If you take monetary and fiscal stimulus, that transmission effect of most of that is not been happening since the 2008 financial crisis. If you talk about geopolitics, the China +1 strategy, it's working to some extent, but it's not happened with the speed and scale that we want. So incentives is not working. I think that is why some of the governments are going back to the fundamentals, which is looking at whether we have the capex and whether we have the financing and whether we have the talent to situate our industry. And I think there too, there is a distinction that I'd like to make. Raw materials, energy, agriculture, rare earths, these are not industries that can be moved easily. So that leaves us with maybe manufacturing of certain lighter products, maybe some textiles, but India is not benefiting. Benefited a little bit, but it's gone mostly to Vietnam and Bangladesh. And it leaves some high-tech industries like electronics. So I think that, the part that the Indian government has got it right, I want to re-emphasize that, is that it is, instead of focusing on incentives alone, focusing on building out the firms and the industry. And I think that is the correct approach. That's what's going to work. And the focus on green and digital, which has not come up in this discussion. And so in the Indo-Pacific, when the supply chains start to realign, it's not realigning because it's moving out of critical industries or raw materials. It is realigning when it comes to digital and green and pharmaceuticals. And I think there is a trend for the industry to go back to the drawing board and go back to the fundamentals. And I think that's the right thing to do.
Thank you so much, Akshay. I'll open it to the floor if anyone's got questions before we wrap up. Any questions? Okay. No more? Okay. Thanks very much. Look, I think it's been a great discussion we've had, and I am pleased to say that we still have 1 minute and 30 seconds for this session, so I've done it before your dinner time. To our guests in India, we really want to thank you for joining us in this occasion. Your insights are very valuable. And to my panelists out here, the three of them, thank you so much for taking your time out on a Wednesday evening. Can we just join and give them a round of applause? Thank you very much. Let's go down. Thank you guys from India. Good night.
Thank you, Sunil. Finally this evening, it's my pleasure to invite Changlani, member of the INZBC board, to give a quick vote of thanks before we head for dinner.
Thank you, guys. I promise I'll be finishing in 2 minutes. I will not take more than 2 minutes. It's a hard act to follow when you're between dinner and people who are tired. So, quickly. Iharu tau to ite tau takiti, ingre te to takiti. Meaning, my strength is not that of a single warrior, but that of many. Kia ora and namaste. My name is Jai Changlani, and it's an absolute pleasure and honor to stand here and talk about and give the vote of thanks for INZBC. In room of all these screens and people and leader and diplomat and international humans, as we see, it's an honor to bring this to close this evening, which was tangible, solid, and real insights. I would like to express my thanks to Honorable Nanaya Mathur, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, for delivering the keynote. Thank you to Shri V. Muralidharan, India's Minister of State for External Affairs, for sending his recordings. I would like to acknowledge again and thank all the dignitaries in the room and also online, Dr. Gaurav Sharma, His Excellency Mukesh Pradeshi, Mr. Reno Tiri Takene, Mr. Bao Dylan, my good friend, Mr. Meng Foon, and all other dignitaries who took their time to come along and attend this important dialogue. Not to forget the people from India and Honorable David Pine, Mr. Ralph Hayes, Rajiv Bhatia, Mr. Deepak Bagla, and Akshay Mathur. And also all our partners. I should acknowledge this. Westpac HCL, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, High Commission of India. I'd like to acknowledge all the sponsors, NZTE, Zespri, Asia New Zealand Foundation, Relab, Beccatelli, Incredible India, Market Jenkins, and Trust Arena. And finally, our supporters, people who came along and supported us by actually getting the tables. BNZ, thank you so much. RBS Intellect, Universal Granite, Orb 360, Duco Consulting, MartinJenkins, CC Group, Bihar Foundation, PwC, and Bank of India. Special thanks to our industry partner, CII and FICCI, who lent us support to make this success. And let's now join our hands in applause to all the speakers and panelists who were present today and share their valuable insight. Thank you, guys. Finally, just a final few words. Thank you to His Excellency Mukesh Pradeshi, Second Secretary Mr. Paramjit Singh for the guidance and efforts in making this summit success. And go and have a nice dinner there. Thank you guys. Have a good time.